In the eyes of Hollywood, he was a joke, a drunken buffoon mocked by millions on the silver screen in The Merry Widow. But in reality, he was a hardened warrior born in the fierce mountains of Montenegro, a man who had spent 50 years preparing to lead a nation of fighters. Yet when destiny finally placed the crown upon his head, he held it for exactly 144 hours, 6 days, and then he walked away. His name was Danilo Aleksandar Petrović-Njegoš. Why would a man who spent a lifetime waiting to be king give it all up in less than a week? Was this a shameful act of cowardice or the ultimate tragic sacrifice to save his people? Our story begins in 1871 in Cetinje, the capital of the Principality of Montenegro. Now, when you hear the word capital, you might picture the gaslit boulevards of Paris, the imperial grandeur of Vienna, or the bustling streets of London. Cetinje was none of these. It was a tiny village nestled in a limestone crater, surrounded by a sea of jagged gray peaks. The population was barely a few thousand souls. The royal palace was not a sprawling Versailles of marble and gold, but a modest two-story building that resembled a well-to-do merchant's house more than a seat of power. Yet, in this small, rugged place, the heart of a warrior nation beat with a ferocity that the great empires of Europe could neither tame nor ignore. Montenegro was the Black Mountain. For centuries it had stood as a lone island of Orthodox Christianity in a sea of Ottoman Islamic rule. While the rest of the Balkans had fallen to the Turks, the Montenegrins had retreated into their impregnable highlands, fighting a ceaseless, brutal war for survival. Every man was a soldier. Every house was a fortress. In this culture, a man's worth was measured by his courage, his skill with a saber, and his loyalty to the clan. It was a society bound by blood feuds and epic poetry, where history was not written in books, but sung by guslers around the fire, songs of heroism, martyrdom, and the severed heads of enemies. It was into this world of blood and stone that Danilo was born on June 29th, 1871. He was the first son of Prince Nicholas I, a man of immense ambition and formidable presence. Nicholas was a poet warrior, a ruler who could recite verses by the campfire one moment and lead a cavalry charge the next. For Nicholas, the birth of a son was not just a family joy, it was a dynastic necessity. He had already fathered daughters, but a son meant stability. A son meant the Petrović-Njegoš line would continue. A son meant there was a future. When the cannons fired from the monastery to announce the birth of the crown prince, the mountains echoed with the sound. Men in the streets fired their pistols into the air, a traditional Montenegrin salute. The baby was named Danilo after his great-uncle Prince Danilo I, a reformer who had begun the modernization of the state. From his very first breath, the infant Danilo carried the weight of a nation's expectation. He was not just a child. He was the Nadezhda, the hope. He was the vessel into which the dreams of 5 centuries of resistance were poured. Growing up in Cetinje, Danilo's childhood was a strange blend of rustic simplicity and high diplomatic intrigue. The court of King Nicholas was unique in Europe. It was accessible. The prince would often sit under a great elm tree in front of the palace, dispensing justice to peasants who came to him with disputes over sheep or property boundaries. Young Danilo would have watched this, learning early on that a Montenegrin ruler was not a distant figurehead, but a father to his people, intimately involved in the grit of their daily lives. But Nicholas had ambitions that stretched far beyond the limestone crags of Cetinje. He was a shrewd political operator who understood that Montenegro's survival depended on powerful friends. He looked to the great powers, specifically to Russia, the great Slavic brother in the north. To secure his small country's place in the world, Nicholas embarked on a marital strategy so successful that he would later be known as the father-in-law of Europe. He was determined to marry his beautiful daughters into the highest royal houses of the continent. For Danilo, this meant that his sisters were not just playmates, but pawns in a grand geopolitical game. He watched as his sister Elena was groomed to become the Queen of Italy. He watched as Melita and Anastasia were sent off to marry Russian Grand Dukes, penetrating the inner circle of the Romanov dynasty. The palace in Cetinje, though small, became a crossroads of European diplomacy. Italian counts, Russian generals, and British diplomats were constant guests, bringing with them the manners and intrigues of the outside world. Danilo, as the heir, was the centerpiece of this strategy. His education could not be left to local priests. He needed to be molded into a European prince, someone who could hold his own in the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg and Paris, yet still command the respect of the rough Highland clansmen. This duality would define, and perhaps fracture, his entire life. He was expected to be two men at once, a sophisticated Western aristocrat and a rugged Balkan warlord. At a tender age, the young prince was sent away from the stark beauty of Montenegro to the glittering, freezing majesty of St. Petersburg. The transition must have been overwhelming. He went from a village where the night sky was lit only by stars and the occasional fire, to the imperial capital of Russia, a city of granite embankments, golden spires, and electric lights. He was enrolled in the Corps of Pages, the most exclusive military academy in the Russian Empire. Here, under the watchful eye of the Romanovs, Danilo was stripped of his provincial edges. He learned French, the language of diplomacy. He learned to dance the mazurka and the waltz. He learned the subtle art of court etiquette, how to bow, how to address an empress, how to hide one's true thoughts behind a mask of polite indifference. But he also learned the art of modern warfare. He studied strategy, artillery, and logistics. The Russians were keen to train him, for they saw Montenegro as a useful thorn in the side of the Ottoman Empire, a loyal outpost on the Adriatic Sea. Yet one can imagine the loneliness of the young Highlander. St. Petersburg was a city of damp fogs and endless winters, a stark contrast to the crisp, dry air of his mountain home. Did he miss the sound of the guzzle? Did he miss the informality of Cetinje, where a prince could walk the streets without a phalanx of guards? In Russia, the Tsar was a semi-divine figure, separated from his people by layers of bureaucracy and protocol. In Montenegro, the prince was a man among men. This cultural chasm must have been confusing for a boy trying to find his identity. Despite the luxury of the Russian court, Danilo remained tethered to his homeland. His father, Nicholas, kept a tight leash on him. Letters flowed back and forth, filled with instructions, admonishments, and reminders of his duty. Nicholas was a loving father but a demanding monarch. He expected Danilo to be perfect, to be the embodiment of the dynasty's future. There was little room for Danilo's own personality to flourish. He was the shadow of his father, the echo of a voice that was already booming across Europe. As Danilo matured into a young man, he grew into a figure of striking contradictions. He was handsome, with the dark, intense eyes of his ancestors, and a neatly trimmed mustache that followed the fashion of the day. He wore his military uniform with natural grace, his chest adorned with medals that were not merely decorative but earned through the status of his birth. Yet observers noted a certain melancholy in him, a reserve that contrasted with his father's gregarious, larger-than-life persona. Nicholas was the kind of man who filled a room. Danilo was the kind who watched the room from the corner. Upon his return to Montenegro, the pressure intensified. He was now the crown prince in residence, the second most important man in the country. He served as his father's aide-de-camp, a role that required him to be constantly at the monarch's side. It was a stifling existence. Nicholas was an autocrat in the truest sense. He micromanaged every aspect of the state, from the procurement of rifles to the appointment of village teachers. Danilo was given titles and responsibilities, but little true power. He was an understudy waiting in the wings for a lead actor who showed no signs of leaving the stage. This endless purgatory exacted a heavy psychological toll. For 50 years, Danilo woke up every morning studying how to be a king, yet went to sleep every night still merely a prince. He was trapped in a state of suspended animation, paralyzed by the overwhelming shadow of a father who was too healthy, too dominant, and unwilling to share the spotlight. This erosion of will created a man who was professionally prepared, but emotionally hollowed out. By the time the crown finally came within reach, it no longer looked like a prize or a responsibility. It looked like a dusty relic from a life he had already outgrown. It was during this period of waiting that the issue of marriage arose. In a dynastic system, a prince without a wife is a crisis waiting to happen. The succession must be secured. Nicholas, the master matchmaker, scoured the almanacs of European royalty to find a suitable bride for his heir. The search was not easy. Montenegro, despite its heroic reputation, was still poor and relatively insignificant in terms of wealth. A marriage alliance had to bring political benefits, but it also had to be acceptable to the great powers. The choice finally fell upon Duchess Jutta of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She was a German princess, a member of a solid, respectable Protestant house, with connections to the British royal family. The match was a coup for Montenegro. A German duchess moving to the rocky Balkans was a sign that the Petrović-Njegoš dynasty had truly arrived. Jutta was born in 1880, 9 years younger than Danilo. She was described as intelligent, spirited, and willing to adapt. To marry Danilo, she agreed to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, taking the name Milica to sound more Montenegrin, though she would largely be known as Jutta to her Western relatives. The wedding, held on July 27, 1899, in Cetinje, was a spectacle intended to dazzle. Journalists from London, Paris, and Berlin made the arduous journey up the winding mountain roads to witness the union. They wrote breathless dispatches about the picturesque costumes of the Montenegrin clansmen, the thunder of the celebratory cannons, and the beauty of the bride. For a moment, Cetinje felt like the center of the world. Danilo, in his dress uniform, stood tall beside his German bride, the perfect picture of a future king. But behind the pageantry, there was friction. King Nicholas, ever the pragmatist, had initially been skeptical of the match, reportedly wrangling over the dowry and the political implications. He was a man who counted every gold purper and measured every alliance by what it could deliver for Montenegro's security. Eventually, he had relented, but the initial hesitation cast a faint shadow over the union. More importantly, the marriage brought with it the crushing weight of biological expectation. The entire purpose of this union, in the cold calculus of monarchy, was to produce a son. As the months turned into years, that expectation turned into anxiety. The nurseries in the Blue Palace remained empty. Jutta and Danilo were seemingly a compatible couple. They shared a love of music and a cosmopolitan outlook that set them apart from the more rustic atmosphere of the court. But the child did not come. In a traditional society like Montenegro, where a man's virility was often linked to his progeny and where the survival of the clan depended on male heirs, this was not a private sorrow, it was a public matter. Whispers began to circulate in the coffee houses of Cetinje. Was the fault with the German wife? Was it the prince? The silence from the palace was deafening. Danilo, already a man of reserved temperament, must have felt this failure keenly. He watched his sisters produce children for the thrones of Italy and Russia, watching the next generation of Romanovs and Savoys playing in the gardens of Europe while his own line threatened to end with him. This childlessness created a subtle but widening distance between Danilo and his father. Nicholas had secured the future of the dynasty through his daughters, but his own direct male line, the line that would hold the Montenegrin crown, was in jeopardy. This personal struggle played out against a backdrop of darkening skies over the Balkans. The region was a powder keg. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, was crumbling, and the small nations of the Balkans, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, were circling like wolves, eager to reclaim their ancestral lands. The atmosphere in Cetinje was shifting from diplomatic pleasantries to martial preparation. The songs of the Gusl became more urgent. The talk was no longer of weddings, but of war. Danilo threw himself into his military duties. If he could not be a father, he would be a soldier. This was a role he understood. He had been trained by the Tsar's generals. He knew the theories of Clausewitz and the logistics of modern supply lines. He worked to modernize the Montenegrin army, trying to impose discipline and structure on a force that was essentially a collection of tribal militias. It was a difficult task. The Montenegrin warrior was brave to the point of recklessness, but he disliked taking orders and despised drilling. Danilo, with his St. Petersburg polish, often found himself clashing with the old chieftains who believed that courage alone was enough to defeat the Turks. The test of his efforts came in 1912. The First Balkan War erupted. This was the moment Montenegro had waited for since the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. It was a holy war of liberation. King Nicholas, now an old man, but still burning with the fire of his youth, declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The target was Scutari, a fortress city near the Montenegrin border that had become a symbol of Ottoman oppression. There was a profound dissonance at play here. Danilo was a man of the 20th century, with a mind attuned to the rationality of modern Europe, yet he was expected to lead a people who still lived by the code of the medieval mountain clans. He preferred the structure of a staff map and the nuance of a diplomatic cable. His subjects preferred the visceral glory of the charge and the severed head. He wasn't just different. He was culturally lonely, the only sober pragmatist in a nation drunk on the poetry of martyrdom. He saw the futility of suicidal bravery where others saw only glory. Danilo was given command. This was not a ceremonial role. He was sent to the front lines, tasked with leading the Zeta detachment. The war was brutal. It was fought in freezing rain, in mud that swallowed horses whole, against an enemy that was dug into concrete fortifications. The Merry Widow caricature of a prince sipping champagne would have been unrecognizable here. The real Danilo lived in a tent, his boots caked in mud, reading maps by lantern light while artillery shells shook the ground. He proved himself to be a competent and brave commander. He did not lead from the rear. He was seen among his men, encouraging them, sharing their hardships. For a brief time, the gap between the prince and his people narrowed. In the crucible of war, the St. Petersburg dandy vanished, and the Montenegrin chieftain emerged. He was fighting for the expansion of his country, for the liberation of fellow Christians, and perhaps for his own sense of worth. The Balkan Wars resulted in a victory for the Allies, though at a terrible cost. Montenegro gained territory, expanding its borders significantly. The mood in Cetinje was euphoric. Nicholas was hailed as a conqueror. Danilo rode beside him, the loyal son, the victorious general. It seemed for a fleeting moment that the golden age of the Petrović-Njegoš dynasty had arrived. They had defeated the ancient enemy. They had doubled the size of their kingdom. But history is cruel. The victory was merely the prelude to a much greater catastrophe. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 set off a chain reaction that would engulf the world in fire. Montenegro, bound by ties of blood and treaty to Serbia, could not stand aside. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, King Nicholas mobilized his army. "Destiny calls upon us to defend our Serb brothers," Nicholas proclaimed, and once again Danilo put on his uniform. But this was not the crumbling Ottoman Empire they were facing. This was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, an industrial superpower with vast resources, heavy artillery, and millions of men. Montenegro was a gnat fighting an elephant. The initial months of World War I were a testament to the sheer grit of the Montenegrin people. They held the mountain passes against overwhelming odds. They fought with boulders and knives when the ammunition ran out. Danilo commanded the Lovćen detachment tasked with defending the sacred mountain of Lovćen, the spiritual heart of the nation. It was a position of immense symbolic importance. If Lovćen fell, Montenegro fell. For nearly 2 years they held on, but the tide was irresistible. By late 1915, the Central Powers had crushed Serbia. The Serbian army began its tragic Great Retreat through the snowy mountains of Albania, passing through Montenegro. The Austrians pursued them relentlessly. Montenegro was now alone, facing the full wrath of the Habsburg war machine. January 1916 brought the end. The Austrian offensive broke the Montenegrine lines. The artillery pounded the positions on Mount Lovćen into dust. Danilo, watching from his command post, must have felt a crushing sense of inevitability. His men were starving, freezing, and out of ammunition. There were no more miracles to be had. The royal family faced a harrowing choice. The Serbian king and government had chosen to retreat with their army to the Greek island of Corfu, maintaining a government in exile that would eventually return victorious. But the situation for King Nicholas was different. He was older, his army was encircled, and political intrigue was rife. There were factions within Montenegro and within Serbia that wanted the Petrović dynasty gone. In a decision that would haunt them forever, Nicholas and Danilo decided to leave. They did not retreat with the army, they fled. On January 20th, 1916, they drove down the winding road to the coast, boarded an Italian ship, and sailed across the Adriatic to Italy. Behind them, they left a confused army, a bewildered people in a country that was about to be occupied by the enemy. This departure was the fatal wound to the dynasty's legitimacy. To the Montenegrin people who valued heroism above all else, the king's flight looked like abandonment. The Serbs who had marched through the hell of the Albanian mountains, rather than surrender, looked at Nicholas's comfortable exile in France with disdain. The narrative was set. The Petrović had run away. Danilo landed in France a prince without a country. He was 44 years old. He had spent his life preparing to rule a land of warriors, and now he was a refugee in a land of diplomats. The mountains were gone, replaced by the plush carpets of luxury hotels in Bordeaux and Paris. The sound of the ghazal was replaced by the polite chatter of French society. The exile had begun, and with it, the slow, agonizing death of a dream. The exile of the Petrović-Njegoš family was not a dramatic imprisonment in a dungeon. It was something far more insidious. It was a slow suffocation by luxury and indifference. Upon their arrival in France, the French government, still technically an ally, housed them in the splendid hotels of Bordeaux and later Paris. To the outside observer, it looked like a life of ease. They dined on fine porcelain, they slept in silk sheets, and they were attended to by servants in livery. But for men like King Nicholas and Crown Prince Danilo, whose souls were forged in the harsh limestone of the Balkans, this gilded cage was a torture chamber. They were a government in exile, but they governed nothing. There were no armies to command, no laws to sign, no subjects to hear. Their days were filled with the hollow rituals of court protocol, performed in hotel suites. Ministers would arrive with portfolios full of useless papers, bowing and scraping to a king who had lost his kingdom. They issued proclamations that no one read. They drafted treaties that no one signed. It was a phantom court, acting out a play that the rest of the world had already walked out of. For Danilo, the humiliation was acute. In Montenegro, he had been a man of action, a soldier. Here, he was merely a curiosity. He walked the boulevards of Paris, a figure of impeccable elegance, yet he felt the sting of irrelevance with every step. The French press, once so enamored with the heroic mountaineers, had begun to change its tune. The wind of history was shifting, and it was blowing cold against the Montenegrin exiles. The cause of this shift was the rise of the Yugoslav idea. Across the Balkans, intellectuals and politicians were dreaming of a single, united state for all South Slavs, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and Montenegrins. It was a noble dream on paper, a vision of brotherhood and strength against the great empires. But in practice, for the Petrović dynasty, it was a death sentence. The driving force behind this movement was the Kingdom of Serbia and its prime minister, Nikola Pasic, a cunning political operator known as the Old Fox. Pasic had no intention of creating a federation of equals. He envisioned a greater Serbia, absorbing its neighbors under the Karađorđević crown. Danilo watched with growing horror as the Allies, Britain, France, and even Russia, began to court Serbia. They needed a strong Balkan state to counter Austria-Hungary, and Serbia, with its larger army and proven resilience, was the chosen partner. Montenegro was seen as too small, too archaic, and King Nicholas too unpredictable. The father-in-law of Europe found that his powerful sons-in-law were suddenly too busy to take his calls. The betrayal culminated in the autumn of 1918. The Great War ended. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. The Montenegrin people, starving and exhausted after 3 years of brutal occupation, waited for their king to return. But the French government refused to provide a ship. They refused to issue passports. King Nicholas and Danilo were effectively detained in France, while Serbian troops marched into Montenegro, ostensibly as liberators. What followed was one of the most controversial chapters in Balkan history. Under the protection of Serbian bayonets, a hasty election was organized in Montenegro. It was a sham. The rules were rigged, the voting was public and intimidated, and the candidates were hand-picked Unionists. On November 26, 1918, this body, grandiosely calling itself the Great National Assembly of the Serb people in Montenegro, met in a tobacco warehouse in Podgorica. Far away in a Parisian salon, Danilo received the telegram that shattered his world. The Podgorica Assembly had voted unanimously for two things. First, to unite Montenegro with Serbia under the Karađorđević dynasty. Second, to dethrone King Nicholas I and the entire Petrović-Njegoš house and ban them from ever returning to their homeland. It was a coup d'etat disguised as democracy. A dynasty that had led the nation for 220 years was erased by a show of hands in a warehouse. Danilo read the reports with a cold fury. His father, the old king, raged against the dying of the light. Nicholas fired off telegrams to President Woodrow Wilson, to Prime Minister Lloyd George, pleading for justice, invoking the principles of self-determination. "We are an independent nation," he cried. "We were allies. Is this how you reward loyalty?" But the great powers were tired of war. They were redrawing the map of Europe at the Paris Peace Conference, and a neat, large Yugoslavia looked much tidier on a map than a fragmented Balkans. Montenegro was sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical convenience. This was the moment when the tragedy of Danilo's life turned into a nightmare of isolation. While his country was being erased from the map, Danilo found himself shouting into the void. As he lobbied diplomats in the corridors of Versailles, trying to explain that his people were being occupied by their own allies, he was met with polite indifference and cold shoulders. The Western powers had decided that a unified Yugoslavia was the future, and Montenegro was simply an inconvenience to be swept aside. The father-in-law of Europe and his son were no longer assets. They were embarrassments. Yet the fight was not quite over. In the mountains of Montenegro, the spirit of resistance was not dead. On January 7, 1919, Orthodox Christmas, a rebellion erupted. It became known as the Christmas Uprising. Thousands of loyalists, known as the Greens, after the color of their campaign posters, took up their old rifles and rose against the Serbian unification. They cried out for the return of King Nicholas and the restoration of Montenegro's sovereignty. From his exile in the affluent suburb of Neuilly-sur-Seine, Danilo watched the reports of the uprising with a mixture of hope and despair. He saw the loyalty of the clans, the men who were willing to die for his family's name, but he also saw the futility of it. The Greens were brave, but they were poorly armed and uncoordinated. The Whites, the Unionists, had the backing of the Serbian army and the tacit approval of the French occupation forces. The uprising was crushed with brutal efficiency. Villages were burned, leaders were imprisoned, and the mountains were pacified by force. The dream of restoration was drowning in blood. Danilo, the military man, knew what this meant. A guerrilla war could last for years, but without international support, the outcome was inevitable. The kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, the precursor to Yugoslavia, was a reality, recognized by the world. Montenegro was now just a province, a Banovina. The sense of entrapment was compounded by fear. The French Riviera in the 1920s was not merely a playground for the wealthy, it was a nest of vipers, teeming with spies, informants, and political assassins. Danilo lived with the constant, creeping paranoia that he was being watched by Serbian agents of the Black Hand, by French secret police, and by rival factions. Beside him stood Juta, a woman enduring her own private hell. She was a double outcast. To the Allies, she was a German, a member of the hated enemy race. To her own German relatives, she was a traitor who had converted to Orthodoxy and married into a Slavic clan. In this terrifying limbo, the couple had only each other, holding hands in a gilded cage where the maid might be a spy and the postman might carry a death warrant. With the political battle lost, the years that followed were a slow descent into financial ruin. They moved from Paris to the sunny coast of Antibes, settling in the Villa Les Ailes. But the stipends from foreign governments dried up. The king, who had once dispensed gold coins, now had to worry about paying the grocer. They were reduced to selling jewels and family heirlooms. It is said that there is no poverty as bitter as the poverty of kings, for it is accompanied by the memory of lost splendor. Financial hardship began to set in. The stipends from the foreign governments dried up. The king, who had once dispensed gold coins to his subjects, now had to worry about paying the grocer and the staff. They were reduced to selling jewels and family heirlooms to maintain the facade of royalty. It is said that there is no poverty as bitter as the poverty of kings, for it is accompanied by the memory of lost splendor. Danilo bore the brunt of this decline. He was the dutiful son, managing the household, dealing with the creditors, and shielding his aging parents from the worst of the insults. He was nearing his 50th birthday. He had no child, no kingdom, and no future. His wife Juta remained by his side, a stoic companion in their shared misfortune, but the silence of their childless home echoed the silence of their political relevance. He also had to contend with the internal politics of the exiled court. Even in defeat, the Montenegrin exiles were divided. There were factions and intrigues, men jostling for titles in a government that existed only on paper. Danilo found it all exhausting. He saw the sycophancy for what it was, a desperate attempt to cling to a world that had vanished. He began to withdraw into himself, spending long hours in his study, reading, composing music, and perhaps contemplating the absurdity of his position. It was during these twilight years in Antibes that Danilo's resolve began to harden. He watched his father raging against the injustice of the world, refusing to accept reality. Nicholas believed until his dying breath that the great powers would come to their senses, that a British fleet would appear in the Adriatic to restore him to his throne. He lived in a state of denial that was both tragic and delusional. Danilo, however, was a realist. He saw that the era of absolute monarchies was over. He saw that the map of Europe had been redrawn by blood and iron, and that no amount of diplomatic letters would change it. He realized that the Montenegrin question was closed. The world had moved on. To continue the fight was not heroism. It was a form of madness. On March 1st, 1921, the inevitable happened. King Nicholas I died of a cerebral hemorrhage. The giant of the Balkans, the man who had ruled for 60 years, was gone. The villa in Antibes was plunged into mourning. But amidst the weeping and the prayers, a terrifying weight descended upon the shoulders of the crown prince. According to the laws of succession, the moment Nicholas's heart stopped beating, Danilo became king. The courtiers, the ministers of the government in exile, and the surviving loyalist generals immediately turned to him. They bowed low. "Your Majesty," they murmured. They looked at him with desperate eyes, expecting him to pick up the fallen banner. They expected him to issue a proclamation denouncing the Yugoslav state. They expected him to call for a new uprising. They expected him to be Nicholas II. Danilo looked at them. He saw the grief in their faces, but he also saw the trap. He saw the crown that they were offering him. It was not a crown of gold and jewels. It was a crown of thorns. It was a crown of debt, of exile, of endless futile struggle. It was a crown that would require him to lie to his people, to promise them a victory that he knew would never come. He was 50 years old. He was tired. And for the first time in his life, he held the power to make a choice. He accepted the title. He allowed himself to be proclaimed King Danilo II. He received the telegrams of condolence. He stood by his father's coffin, receiving the few foreign dignitaries who bothered to attend. For 6 days he played the part. He was the head of the house, the sovereign of Montenegro. But in the quiet of his own mind, the decision had already been made. He looked at the map of the new Europe. He looked at his childless marriage. He looked at his young nephew, Michael, who was innocent of the political sins of the past. And he realized that the greatest service he could render to his dynasty was not to fight, but to surrender. He would not be the king of a graveyard. He would not be the king of a hotel room. He would be the man who ended it. For those 6 days in March 1921, The Villa Leal in Antibes became the quietest royal court in Europe. There were no trumpets, no parades, no cheering crowds. There was only the sound of the Mediterranean wind rattling the shutters and the hushed whispers of the exile community. Danilo, now king, moved through the corridors like a ghost. He wore the black armband of mourning for his father, but the darkness in his eyes spoke of a deeper, more personal grief. He was mourning not just a man, but an era. The pressure upon him was suffocating. The old guard of the Montenegrin court, generals like Janko Vukotic and politicians who had served his father for decades, encircled him. They were desperate men clinging to the wreckage of their careers. They urged Danilo to issue a fiery proclamation to declare the annexation null and void, to call upon the League of Nations, to demand an audience with the French president. They wanted him to be the thunderbolt that would shatter the Yugoslav Union. Your Majesty, they would say, the people in the mountains are waiting. One word from you, and the clans will rise again. But Danilo knew the truth about the mountains. He read the intelligence reports that the sycophants tried to hide. He knew that the Serbian army had tightened its grip. He knew that the Christmas uprising had been drowned in blood. He knew that one word from him would not bring liberation. It would bring a massacre. He imagined the young men of Cetinje and Nikšić, boys who had never seen the sea, clutching rusty rifles and charging against machine guns, all for the sake of a king living in a French resort town. He could not do it. He would not be the butcher of his own people. He spent those 6 days in deep introspection. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, the gray hair, the lines etched by years of anxiety, the childless existence. He realized that he represented the past. He was the son of Nicholas, the symbol of the old patriarchal Montenegro that the modern world had rejected. If the dynasty were to survive, it needed a clean slate. It needed innocence. It needed a figure who carried no political baggage, no history of failure. On the morning of March 7th, 1921, the tension in the villa broke. Danilo summoned the government in exile. He summoned his mother, the formidable Queen Milena, who had been the steel spine of the family for half a century. The room was heavy with the scent of stale tobacco and nervous sweat. The ministers stood at attention, expecting a war council. Instead, Danilo remained seated. He did not raise his voice. He did not strike the table. He simply spoke, his voice calm and terrifyingly final. I am abdicating. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The minister stared at him, unable to comprehend the words. Abdication? A Montenegrin king did not abdicate. He died in battle or he died in his bed, but he did not quit. It was anathema to the warrior code. Danilo continued, unperturbed by their shock. I renounce the throne of Montenegro. I renounce the headship of the royal house. I transfer all my rights and the rights of my descendants to my nephew, Prince Michael. Prince Michael was the 13-year-old son of Danilo's deceased brother, Mirko. He was a boy attending school in England, completely removed from the toxic atmosphere of the exile court. He was a blank canvas. By passing the crown to Michael, Danilo was playing a masterstroke of dynastic survival. He was removing himself, the tired, disillusioned, controversial figure, and replacing himself with a child who could be molded, a symbol of pure potential that the royalists could rally around without the baggage of the past. The Queen Mother, Milena, wept. The generals protested. They begged him to reconsider. They appealed to his honor, his duty, his blood. You cannot leave us, they cried. You are the king. I am a private citizen, Danilo corrected them, standing up, and I wish to be left alone. With the stroke of a pen, it was done. The document was signed. The reign of Danilo II, the shortest and most enigmatic in the history of the Balkans, was over. He had ruled for 144 hours. He had issued no laws, minted no coins, and commanded no armies. His only act of kingship was to destroy the king. The news sent shockwaves through the diaspora. In the coffee houses of the Balkans, men spat on the ground when they heard the name Danilo. They called him a coward, a traitor, a man who had sold his birthright for a quiet life. The Serbian press had a field day, painting him as a weakling who fled at the first sign of responsibility. Even his own sisters, the queens of Italy and the grand duchesses of Russia, were appalled. They felt he had disgraced the family honor. But Danilo did not look back. He packed his trunks. He took his wife, Juta, by the hand. They walked out of the Via Lazales, leaving the chaos of the Regency Council behind them. Queen Milena would step in as regent for the young Michael, trying valiantly to keep the flame alive until her death 2 years later. But Danilo was done. He had cut the cord. He and Juta moved to Nice, further along the coast, but spiritually a world away. They rented a modest apartment. They dismissed their retinue. They ceased to use the royal titles in public. To the grocer, the baker, and the neighbors, they were simply Monsieur and Madame Petrović. For the first time in 50 years, Danilo was free. He no longer had to worry about the intrigues of the great powers. He no longer had to read the casualty lists from the mountains. He could walk along the Promenade des Anglais, feeling the sun on his face without wondering if an assassin was watching him. He could listen to music, read books, and simply be. Yet the past has a way of clawing at those who try to escape it. Danilo had walked away from the throne, but he could not walk away from his name. And it was his name that would drag him into one final bizarre battle, not on the fields of Montenegro, but in the courts of Paris. We return to where we started, the shadow of the Merry Widow. Throughout the 1920s, as Danilo tried to fade into obscurity, the operetta continued to conquer the world. It was performed in London, New York, Berlin, and Tokyo. The waltz was played at every wedding. The songs were hummed by millions. And in 1925, Hollywood decided to turn it into a silent film extravaganza, directed by the legendary Erich von Stroheim. The film was a sensation. It was decadent, cynical, and visually stunning. But for Danilo, it was a nightmare. The film depicted Prince Danilo not just as a fun-loving bachelor, but as a degenerate. In one scene, the character is shown drunk in a ditch. In another, he is shown seducing the wife of an ambassador. The kingdom of Monteblanco, a barely disguised Montenegro, was portrayed as a land of pig farmers and bandits. For the real Danilo, living his quiet, dignified life in Nice, this was intolerable. He had sacrificed his crown to save his dignity, only to have that dignity stripped away by a motion picture. He felt that the film was mocking the very tragedy of his nation. It was turning the blood and tears of his people into a slapstick comedy for American audiences. There was a sickening irony in this cultural theft. While audiences in New York and London paid good money to laugh at the merry prince sipping champagne on screen, the real Danilo was quietly selling his wife's jewelry just to pay the butcher and the landlord. Western culture was consuming his identity for entertainment while remaining utterly indifferent to his starvation. The lawsuit was more than a legal battle. It was a primal scream against a world that had reduced his tragic existence to a punchline. In 1927, the man who had refused to fight for a kingdom decided to fight for his reputation. He filed a lawsuit against Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in the French courts. The trial was a spectacle. The press, who had ignored Danilo for years, suddenly descended upon the courtroom. They expected a comedy, the Mad Prince suing the movies. But what they got was a tragedy. Danilo took the stand. He did not rant or rave. He spoke with the quiet, icy precision of a man who has lost everything except his pride. "I am not a character," he told the court. "I am a man. My father was a king. My people were heroes. To portray us as buffoons, to use my baptismal name for a drunken lecher, is an insult not just to me, but to history." The defense lawyers for MGM argued that the character was fictional, that Danilo was a common name, that the film was a satire. They tried to paint the ex-king as oversensitive, a relic seeking attention. But Danilo stood firm. He produced his birth certificate. He produced photographs of himself in uniform, standing in the trenches of the Balkan Wars. He forced the court to look at the reality of his life versus the fantasy on the screen. He argued that while a king may lose his throne, he does not lose his right to his own identity. In a surprising verdict, the French court ruled in his favor. They acknowledged that the film had crossed a line. They awarded him damages in francs, a modest sum that amounted to a mere pittance compared to the millions the film had grossed. It was a pittance compared to the millions the film had grossed. It wouldn't buy back his kingdom. It wouldn't restore his reputation in the Balkans. But it was a victory. It was a moral acknowledgement that he existed. For a moment, the Ghost King had become solid again. He had forced the modern world, the world of cinema and commerce, to bow to the old world of honor and blood. After the trial, Danilo retreated once more. He had made his point. He returned to the shadows of Nice. He watched from afar as the world darkened again. He watched the rise of fascism in Italy, the country where his sister was queen. He watched the rise of Nazism in Germany, the homeland of his wife. He saw the storm clouds gathering over Europe for a second time. He must have felt a grim vindication. He had seen the futility of political ambition. He had seen how easily nations could be destroyed and how quickly heroes could be forgotten. He had chosen to step off the stage before the curtain fell, and as he watched Europe march towards another catastrophe, he perhaps realized that his abdication was the sanest act of his life. His final years were quiet. He and Juta grew old together, a childless couple clinging to each other in a world that had no place for them. They moved to Vienna, perhaps seeking a connection to the old imperial culture that Juta remembered from her youth, or perhaps simply because it was cheaper than the Riviera. It was there, in the ancient capital of the Habsburgs, the very empire that had crushed his army in 1916, that Danilo's story came to its end. In 1938, the Nazis marched into Vienna. The Anschluss. The swastika flags draped the buildings where waltzes had once played. Danilo, now an old man of 67, witnessed the death of another nation, the extinguishing of another sovereignty. He died on September 24, 1939. The Second World War had begun just 3 weeks earlier. Poland was burning and the world was on fire again. Amidst this global cataclysm, the death of a former king of Montenegro went largely unnoticed. He was buried in a foreign grave, far from the limestone rocks of Cetinje. But Danilo's death was not the end of the Petrović-Njegoš story. It was merely the prelude to its greatest test, and this test would reveal the hidden wisdom of his abdication. In 1941, when the Nazi war machine shattered Yugoslavia, Mussolini sought to legitimize his occupation of Montenegro. Fascist strategists tracked down Danilo's nephew, Prince Michael, the very boy Danilo had abdicated to, living in German-occupied France. They offered him a seductive deal, the restoration of his dynasty and an independent state of Montenegro, provided he serve as a figurehead for the Axis powers. It was here that Danilo's legacy bore fruit. Because Danilo had stepped aside years earlier, Michael had been raised away from the desperate obsession with regaining power. Instead of grasping at the throne, Michael delivered a devastatingly honorable no. He refused to accept a crown stained with innocent blood or to betray the Allies. In retaliation, the Nazis imprisoned him in a concentration camp. Yet his refusal left the Montenegrin throne empty and untouchable, preserving the dynasty's integrity through the darkest years of the war. Though Michael survived to see liberation, the communist regime of Tito abolished the monarchy and erased the family from history. For decades, Danilo was reviled as the man who gave up, spoken of with a sneer in the history books of socialist Yugoslavia. But time is the ultimate judge. The forced union that Danilo had refused to fight for eventually collapsed in the 1990s in a spasm of violence. And from those ashes, in 2006, Montenegro emerged once again as an independent nation. The flag of King Nicholas was raised once more over Cetinje. With the return of the country came the vindication of its lost princes. In 2011, Montenegro passed a law officially rehabilitating the dynasty, acknowledging their moral role as guardians of the nation's heritage. Historians began to see Danilo not as a coward, but as a tragic visionary. By stepping aside in 1921, he had prevented a civil war and ensured his family did not become pawns of foreign powers. The king for 6 days was, in the end, a man who understood that the age of kings was ending. He sacrificed his ego to the inevitable current of history. He wore the crown just long enough to feel its weight, and then he laid it down, not because it was too heavy, but because it was hollow. Today, if you visit Cetinje, there is no great monument to Danilo. His monument is the silence. It is the peace of a country that did not tear itself apart. It is the quiet dignity of a man who said no to the madness of power. He was the king who walked away. And in a world obsessed with holding on, his story remains a haunting, necessary reminder of the courage it takes to let go.